All right, good morning, everyone. I see we have 10 a.m. on the dot, so we're going to go ahead and kick off our webinar this morning. Welcome to our August Extension Master Gardener webinar. I'm really excited to have Josh Kardos here with us. I hope you are all staying safe and well and enjoying a good gardening season so far. Please ensure that your microphone has been muted. And then if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat box and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of the session. So those are the only housekeeping items we have. So I'll go ahead and welcome this morning's speaker, Dr. Josh Kardos. Josh is an instructor within the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech and will be speaking with us this morning about hydrangeas. So welcome.
I have to, sorry, I have to unmute myself. You can hear me better now, I believe. Give me a thumbs up if everything's good. Okay. All right, so thank you for joining. As Kathleen said, I'm going to present today on hydrangeas. I don't know if you guys are all webinared out, Zoomed out, but I appreciate you joining today for one more at least. So let me give you a little background about myself before I get started. As Kathleen said, I am an instructor here at Virginia Tech. I actually started that position in January, so welcome to teaching, right? Starting in January and in March, everything shifted online, and it's been kind of a crazy summer, unsure what was going to happen for this fall, but for better or worse, that's how it's been. So a little background on myself. I have been involved in horticulture for quite some time. I would say I've actually worked in horticulture since I was 14. I'll give you a little bit of insider information and tell you that's been 25 years. So I started working when I was in high school in a garden center, local garden center, and went on to work in a wholesale nursery. I've worked in woody production, so shrubs and trees, as well as greenhouses, doing annuals and perennials. I have a bachelor's and a PhD in horticulture from the University of Georgia. I grew up in Georgia. And hydrangeas are near and dear to my heart because I actually worked on hydrangeas, breeding hydrangeas for my dissertation research. After graduate school, I worked for 7 years for an independent plant breeding company. It was a startup company, and we bred mainly flowering shrubs. So guess what? I bred some hydrangeas as well as other things. Did that for about 7 years and then moved to Asheville, North Carolina, where for 4 years I worked for an internationally owned vegetable grafting startup. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of vegetable grafting, but I think it's pretty fascinating. I know it's unrelated to hydrangeas, so I won't talk about that other than to say it was a fantastic experience of working in a high-tech greenhouse and learning some things they don't teach you in hort degrees, such as managing processes and leading people. Wow, that has nothing to do with growing plants, but I learned a lot. So fast forward, and I am here now teaching at Virginia Tech. We chose to move here because this is where we wanted to be, to relocate for our family. And I'm excited to have this position and to share with the students from my years of experience in the industry as well as my education. So with that, today we're going to talk about how to get the most out of your hydrangeas. I presented a webinar about a month ago for amateur gardeners talking about hydrangeas. It was a shorter webinar, and the focus of that one was more avoiding the three most common mistakes people make with hydrangeas. So today what I'm hoping to do is to present to you guys, give you some information to hopefully you learn something, hopefully you get more excited about hydrangeas, and hopefully you are better equipped to answer questions that you receive about hydrangeas. Well, oh, there we go. Okay. So what makes a hydrangea a hydrangea? Well, as a group, they are grown because they're popular flowering shrubs. So depending on who you ask, there's approximately 23 species. Now, seems like maybe we should define that a little better. Like, why don't we know how many species they are? Not everybody agrees on this. Okay, so when it comes to taxonomy, depends on how you look at the plant, how you group the plants. And so we're going to go with there's about 23 species. But out of these 23, there's just a handful that are actually grown widely in the US. So out of this group, again, they're grown because they're flowering shrubs. They have large, showy flowers. But actually, they really don't have large, showy flowers. They produce large inflorescences, which is a cluster of flowers, but specifically in hydrangeas, when we talk about the showy portion, it's actually not the fertile flowers. They're sterile florets, also known as ray flowers. But even more confusing, the showiest part is they're not even petals, they're sepals. So those are some technicalities, but nevertheless, they're showy. So that's why we grow hydrangeas. We don't grow hydrangeas really for their foliage or for stem characteristics, though some of those are interesting. It's for the flowers. And as we'll talk about today, I'm hoping to give you some tips on how to ensure successful flowering of hydrangeas. So the inflorescence, or the group of flowers, is usually a corymb, which is a rounded inflorescence. Think of this as maybe kind of a softball or a lumpy softball. This is a picture of Hydrangea arborescens, or a smooth hydrangea, and this is the typical type of flower structure. I'm going to say flower. I'm going to quit saying inflorescence, okay? We're just going to say flower, but I want to get that out of the way, that there's multiple flowers in a given inflorescence. So this rounded shape is what you normally see. This is characteristic of most of the species, with the exception of two that we'll talk about today, and those have a panicle-shaped inflorescence. So when we look at the genus as a whole, there's a range of colors, and we're going to talk more about flower colors and specific species in a little bit. But when we look at individual species, the colors are more limited. So the broadest range of flower colors is limited to a single species. All right, so to highlight this just a little bit further, when I was mentioning the inflorescence structure and the flowers, if you look at this picture on the left-hand side, this is a selection of Hydrangea arborescens. And this one is fairly typical, or looks fairly similar to what you would see in the wild. So as we'll talk about in a little bit, Hydrangea arborescens is native to the eastern US. And if you were to see this plant in the wild, you would see a plant that looks fairly similar to this one. Now this plant is actually gone past flowering and is beginning to set seed now. So when you look at this inflorescence here that I'm showing at the bottom of the screen, these are all of the fertile flowers here in the center. They're actually developing into fruits now containing the seeds, and these are not showy at all. These flowers around the outside are the sterile florets, or the ray flowers, and the part that really you see are the sepals. So this is the wild type over here on the left versus on the right. Now this is a different species. This is Hydrangea paniculata, but this was selected for these very large full inflorescences that have lots of these showy sepals. So I just want to point that out, that when we talk about hydrangeas, this is kind of an interesting thing, that the plants that we typically are growing in our gardens today and that we see for sale really look very little, from the flower structure, look very little like what we would see in the wild. Okay, so a little bit more about what makes a hydrangea a hydrangea. They all have in common that they have medium to large leaves, and this is an important point that we'll come back to right at the end of this talk. They are all deciduous. As you guys know, that means that they lose their leaves, so they don't carry the foliage through the winter. Many people would consider hydrangeas to be nostalgic, and what I mean by this is mainly that when you think of hydrangeas, you may think of a parent, you may think of a grandparent. For me, I think of my grandmother, because my grandmother is actually the one that introduced me to plants, that introduced me to horticulture. She's the one, I would say I was 12 or 13 when I started working in her garden, and I was fascinated. I loved it. Now, let me clarify. I didn't love pulling weeds. I didn't love digging holes in the hard Georgia clay What I loved though was just being outside and working with plants. And what fascinated me, what hooked me on horticulture, was when she showed me how to propagate plants, how to root cuttings. My mind was blown that you could take a cutting off of a plant, you could root it and grow a new plant. This was amazing, and that's what hooked me. But my grandmother grew hydrangeas, and so that was one of the plants she showed me how to propagate. And she still grows, well, okay, she just moved out of her house, but she still had hydrangeas in her garden. And so when I think of hydrangeas, I think of my grandmother. If you've ever driven around old homesteads, kind of in the southeast, you may have seen old hydrangeas growing around even the foundation that's left from an old house. But hydrangeas had sort of grown out of fashion. They had become somewhat considered old-fashioned. And let's be real, a lot of people sort of associated that with their grandmother, and they were like, that was my grandmother's plant. You know, that's not a cool plant today. But thanks to Martha Stewart for reinvigorating people about hydrangeas and really pushing that hydrangeas were cool. And there were some new hydrangeas, which also really helped to invigorate plant breeders to develop new varieties. All of a sudden, there's more interest in hydrangeas. So they've really come back into fashion. There's a lot of new breeding, a lot of new cultivars that are available now. But unfortunately, many gardeners do not have success. So we see pictures like the one that was on the title slide. Like that's the stuff people show on Instagram, right? I'm not on Facebook or I don't know, other things, but those are the kind of pictures that you see there. And then this picture is the kind of picture that people post on like gardening help sites. You know, you don't put this out there on Instagram and say, hey, look at my hydrangea. But unfortunately, this is what happens to a lot of people with hydrangeas. And they're disappointed, they're discouraged. So I want to help give you some information so we can avoid this sort of situation. So I am going to spend a little bit of time to go through what I consider the most common mistakes with hydrangeas and give you some tips that you can, again, help answer questions to help people avoid these mistakes. This may be basic information to some of you. Maybe some of you learned some new things. But I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. Choosing the wrong plant or site, or we could say choosing the wrong plant for the site, choosing an inferior cultivar, pruning at the wrong time, and then not watering and or fertilizing properly. So when we talk about hydrangeas, I said there's 23 species, but I'm only going to talk about 4 today. These are the most widely grown of all the hydrangeas. But guess what? Out of these 4, there's one for every site. So it doesn't matter whether your site receives full sun, full shade, part sun, there's a hydrangea for you. So there are hydrangeas that specifically need these different sun exposures. Now, when we talk about shade, for example, usually afternoon shade is going to be most important. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the key point here is that when it comes to choosing a hydrangea, you really want to choose the site first. You want to determine where you're going to plant the hydrangea, then choose the appropriate type of hydrangea. Now, I know this seems basic, but let's be real here. How many of us actually buy plants on impulse? And if we skip down to the bottom, I'm saying avoid impulse buys if possible, because we're gardeners, we love plants, and I know you're going to do it. You guys have done it before. And you can say, I promise that's the last time. I'm not going to buy another plant on impulse. And then you go to the garden center and you do it again. So the key here, though, is that before you plant that plant, you want to evaluate the site. So even if you've committed the sin of buying the impulse hydrangea and you didn't know where you're going to put it, don't rush home and plant it until you've looked at your garden, you've looked at the site. Observe it over the course of a day. And what are you looking for? You're looking primarily at sun exposure. And this, again, may seem common sense, but think about this for a minute. Especially people who are newer to gardening may make some of these basic mistakes. Like they may look out the window, because they look out that kitchen window every morning when they're making their coffee and grabbing their food, rushing out the door to work. And every morning when they look out, that spot is in the shade. So they think of that as a shady spot. What they may not realize is that right about noon all of a sudden that spot is in full blazing sun for the next 4 hours. And guess what? It's in the shade again when they get home in the evening. So they consider it a shady spot because that's how they see it. But the plant is going to be exposed to several hours of intense sun, and that can really have a negative impact on specific types of hydrangeas. So observe the sun exposure. Another thing you can do is to look at what other plants are nearby. Now, obviously, if you already have a hydrangea and it's in that spot, clear, this is not an issue. But look at the other plants that are growing nearby. What types of plants are those, and are they doing well or not? And this can help you to determine what type of site you have and which type of hydrangea you should plant. Okay, so you've all first observed the site, you know the sun exposure, so now you have to choose which kind of plant that you're going to get. So let's say your site has full sun. Well, you're in luck. There's a hydrangea just for that. Panicle hydrangea, or Hydrangea paniculata, is actually probably the toughest, most urban tolerant of all the hydrangeas. So this can withstand really the most abuse. Does very, very well in full sun. In fact, it's at its best in full sun. If we put this one into shade, which it can go into a little bit of shade. I don't want to pigeonhole plants and say this plant can only go in full sun. It can tolerate some shade. Just understand, if we put a plant that prefers full sun into a partially shaded environment, it's going to tend to get a little taller, a little leggier. It's just not going to look as nice. But with panicle hydrangeas, the name gives it away. This is one of the two species that has this panicle-shaped inflorescence. So as you see, this is not a ball or an orb or a rounded inflorescence. It's kind of more of a spike. So with panicle hydrangea, the flowers are usually white, but some of these can age to pink. But I want to give a little bit of information on this because, again, we're all guilty of this. We're all guilty of looking online at images of plants and then buying a plant and planting it, and guess what? It doesn't actually look like the image. That's kind of the world we live in, right? You know, you go to the, okay, let's be real. Some of us eat fast food occasionally, and when you have to, you go there and you look at the picture on the menu, and then you get the burger and it looks nothing like the picture, and then, okay. So sometimes that happens with plants. And one of the issues here is that a Hydrangea paniculata that starts out white but ages to pink is going to be at its best in a cooler climate. A climate maybe at higher elevation that has some cooler night temperatures. And this is all relative, okay? So I grew up in Georgia, grew up in Athens, Georgia. The last summer I was there, we had 30 days over 100 degrees. And every single day that summer, it was over 90. At night, we would get into the 70s, sometimes the upper 70s. High humidity. This is very stressful on plants. So if we take a Hydrangea paniculata that was actually bred in Europe in a cooler climate, that over there it aged to this beautiful pink, and we planted it in a site like that, what would happen is it would age brown. It didn't develop that pink coloration. So again, understanding your site, your climate, and where the plants come from. So some of these can age pink, but they're not always going to turn this like beautiful pink that you see on the tag. Very important to point out with Hydrangea paniculata, there's a wide range of sizes. So the old-fashioned, some of the older cultivars of panicle hydrangea get quite large. They can actually be large shrubs, small trees. But there's some newer selections that are dwarf or compact. So it's important when you're looking at that site that you've looked at sun exposure, but you've also looked at how much space do you have? You know, do you have space for a 10-foot shrub, or do you have space for a 4-foot shrub? So then choose a cultivar appropriately. Now, for people who are into native plants, remember all plants are native to somewhere, just not always native to North America. So if you want to plant plants native to North America, I'm sorry, this one isn't for you. This one's native to Japan and China, but don't lose heart. There are 2 hydrangeas we'll talk about in a minute that are native to the US. Now, with any plant, and we'll talk a little more about cultivar selection later, once you've chosen the species based on your site, you have to choose a cultivar. You have to choose a selection because almost all flowering shrubs now are sold by a specific cultivar or trademark or brand name. And I know that gets kind of confusing, but rarely are you going to go to a garden center anymore and find just a Hydrangea paniculata. It's probably not going to happen. You may find an oak leaf hydrangea without a cultivar name, but with most hydrangeas, there's going to be some cultivar name, brand name, trademark name attached. So I'm just highlighting a few. I don't receive any money for the sale of these plants. I'll give that disclaimer. I was a plant breeder. Even plants that I introduced, I still get no royalties for it. It was all licensed to the company. I didn't own the company. So I personally think some of them are good plants, but just know these are relatively unbiased opinions, but they are opinions. So some recommended selections would be Limelight, Little Lime, which is a more compact version, Strawberry Sundae, which is one that does age to a pink color, and Bobo, which is a compact selection. There's plenty more though, so I'm not saying these are the only 4 that you could plant. Okay, so what if your site has part sun or part shade? As I mentioned, you can plant panicle hydrangea here and it will do okay. It's going to do its best in full sun. But you're in luck because this is the type of site where you have the most options, because you could plant a panicle hydrangea, but you can also plant smooth hydrangea or Hydrangea arborescens. Now, Hydrangea arborescens also has white flowers, but this one has that rounded flower structure that we're kind of used to seeing when we see hydrangeas. There are a few pink selections, but I will say that the pink selections they're not quite as sturdy. They don't grow quite as strong. They tend to have a few more problems than the white selections. So I'm not saying you can't plant one. They're just not quite as vigorous as the white selections are. Overall, these plants are moderate in size, about 3 to 5 feet tall and wide. Now, they can sucker and spread. Now, this is not an aggressive plant. It's not going to take over your garden. I'm not talking about bamboo, but it can get a little bigger. So they'll tend to spread a little bit with age, but they're easy to maintain. These are easy to prune. In fact, many people cut Hydrangea arborescens back to the ground every year, and it grows back and it flowers and it's beautiful. So we'll talk more about pruning later. This one is native to much of the eastern US. So if you're looking for a native plant, you're in luck because this one is native. Now, again, keep in mind though, these are selections of native plants. There are people who fall anywhere on the spectrum of interest in native plants, purists that say it has to be, you know, a seedling from a plant locally native to me, versus people who would say on the other end that cultivars or selections of native species are also considered native. So these are selections of a native species. 2 that I would recommend are Annabelle, which is what's shown in this picture. Annabelle is an old cultivar. It's been around for quite a while, but it's very, very reliable. It's one of the best. There are some improvements, but this is a pretty good one. And then Invincibelle Limetta is a newer one. Okay, some additional options if you have that part sun or part shade environment. Big leaf hydrangea or Hydrangea macrophylla. This is the one in the upper right-hand picture. So this is the one that even people who don't really know what hydrangeas are think of this when they hear hydrangea. They've at least seen this on a magazine cover. They've seen it somewhere in a picture. This is what most of us are thinking of when we think of hydrangeas. This species is native to Japan, similar in size to Hydrangea arborescens, about 3 to 5 feet tall and wide, so pretty moderate in size. This is the species that has the broadest range of flower colors. So we can have whites, but we can have pinks, we can have blues, purples, near reds, no yellows, no oranges, but nearly everything else in between. Sometimes bicolors, doubles, different things like that. So lots of options when it comes to flower color. When you're looking at Hydrangea macrophylla, it is best to choose a reblooming cultivar. We're going to talk more about what that means, but just consider right now that a reblooming cultivar is going to flower more reliably than some of the others. So as far as recommended selections go, I'm a big fan of the Endless Summer brand. Really any of those I think are good options. The original, Summer Crush, Bloomstruck. This picture happens to be Bloomstruck, has a very nice flower color that can go from blue to kind of a deep purple. But those are just a few options. Remember, like literally hundreds of cultivars of Hydrangea macrophylla out there. So many others you can choose from. One other option for this part sun, part shade environment would be oak leaf hydrangea or Hydrangea quercifolia. This one is also native. It's native to the southeast US. And again, though, the flowers are going to be typically white in this panicle shape. Some of these can age to pink, so there is an option there, kind of like we saw with Hydrangea paniculata. And similar to Hydrangea paniculata, oak leaf hydrangea can get pretty large and widespread with age. So consider that when you're thinking about planting an oak leaf hydrangea, that if you have a space that's only big enough for a 4 or 5 foot shrub, and you put one of the cultivars of oak leaf hydrangea that can get 10, 12 feet, it's going to outgrow that site. So make sure that you're choosing an appropriate cultivar. Now it's named oak leaf hydrangea because it has this unique foliage. So you see these deeply lobed leaves. These are unique in all of the species of hydrangeas. All the other hydrangeas have a more rounded to pointed leaf shape with an entire leaf margin, and these have these lobed leaves. That's where it gets the name from. Already mentioned that it's native. Keep in mind that just the straight species Hydrangea quercifolia, because sometimes you go to a garden center and still find plants labeled just Hydrangea quercifolia with no cultivar associated. I'm not saying you can't buy that, but those plants tend to be a little more open, a little more rangy. The foliage may not be as nice. So a lot of the selections have been selected because they have fuller flowers. The flowers are nicer, they're held more upright. The foliage is darker green. This picture happens to be jet stream. You see how nice and dark green and clean this foliage is. There's no leaf spot on it. So jet stream is one cultivar I recommend that's more compact than the species. And ruby slippers is another that is also compact, but ruby slippers, the flowers age to this nice kind of a ruby red. And ruby slippers was actually developed in Tennessee by Sandra Reed, Dr. Sandra Reed, who was with the USDA. So that one was selected in Tennessee and still turned a nice color in the heat there. So that one's pretty reliable. Okay, so we've talked about the 4 species, but the final type of site that we would have is one that is full shade. And again, keep in mind that yes, you could plant any of those part sun plants in the shade. They're not going to die, they're just not going to do their best. And so the best option really for full shade is going to be big leaf hydrangea. You have this range of flower colors that really pops in a more shaded environment. And with Hydrangea macrophylla, it's also important if you're going into a part shade environment, ideally it would have shade in the afternoon. The morning sun is less intense. So these plants, if they're going to receive some sun, do better with morning sun and afternoon shade. But lots of colors available here within the species. And this species has also this interesting characteristic that if we look, what we typically think of when we think of big leaf hydrangea are these large, what we would call mop head inflorescences, flower structures here, the rounded type. That's the most common, but this upper right-hand picture and in the background of the lower left-hand picture are what we call a lace cap. So those are a flower structure where the center is made up of the fertile flowers, and then there's that outer ring of sterile florets or ray flowers that make up the showy portion of the plant. So now that you have seen, or now that we've gone through how you would determine which type of hydrangea to plant based on the site, the next step would be choosing the cultivar. So what is the next mistake that people commonly make? Choosing an inferior cultivar. So beyond just what species, based on the characteristics of that site, it's important that you're looking at different criteria when you're choosing a cultivar. So what are those criteria? Well, this would include things like the growth habit and size. So I mentioned for several of these that there are options. Think back to panicle hydrangea. We can have compact 3 to 4 foot plants, or we can have 12 to 14 foot tall large shrubs to almost small trees. So it's very important that you're paying attention to the growth habit and the size not just which species. Flower color. Now, flower color is less of an issue for most of these species because pretty much you're stuck with white. But when it comes to Hydrangea macrophylla or big leaf hydrangea, you do have options on flower color. Flowering reliability, I don't know if that's really the best term. What I'm trying to say is that some of the cultivars flower more reliably than others. So we're going to talk in just a minute more about flowering and what goes into determining how well a plant flowers, but keep that in mind that some of these flower more reliably than others. What about foliage quality? We don't really talk too much about foliage when it comes to hydrangeas. We think of these as flowering shrubs. That's why we plant them, but foliage quality is important because if we look at this picture, as we see, now this plant looks a little hungry. It looks like it could use a little bit of nitrogen, but even so, it still has a paler green leaf. Whereas some hydrangeas have a darker green, almost glossy, thick leaf, much higher quality foliage that also can withstand droughty conditions a little bit better. So considering foliage quality, disease resistance. Don't have time to talk much about diseases, but if we talk specifically about Hydrangea macrophylla, there are really two diseases that affect those plants. One is powdery mildew, which looks sort of like a gray powder on the leaves. And the other would be leaf spot, and leaf spot can really affect the other species as well. So if we're looking at disease resistance, we're looking at foliage quality, we're looking at flowering reliability, flower color, and growth habit, then this is going to help guide your decision of which cultivar to choose. Now, the final point I want to mention in this list is new does not necessarily mean better. Unfortunately, I would say over the past decade or so, there's been a lot of breeding, especially in flowering shrubs, and there's a lot of new plants out there, but new doesn't necessarily mean better. So just because it's a new plant, you might be well advised to let somebody else try it first, to look at a reliable source for how it performs. So there are trial gardens around the country. There's universities that trial plants. There's different places where you can look and see how these plants have performed. And just considering also, again, this is not always an indicator, but if you're looking at a company or a brand that's putting out dozens of new plants every year versus one that maybe is introducing 1 or 2 or 3 new plants, you could pretty much assume that there's been more testing going into those fewer plants. So just remember that. I've already mentioned this, resist the urge to make impulse purchases, especially of unproven cultivars. A lot of these new plants are not inexpensive. They're in branded pots with nice shiny tags, and what you don't know is there's a royalty attached to that plant because oftentimes they're patented. There's a lot of cost that goes into that, and so when you buy that plant, you may be disappointed by an underwhelming plant. So maybe look to see how it's performed somewhere else before you dive in and purchase it. One last point on this is that florist hydrangeas do not make good garden plants. Now here I'm specifically talking about Hydrangea macrophylla. You've all seen in the grocery store the pot plant with the little foil wrapper around it and about 4 or 5 sturdy stems with a nice flower right on top. And those plants are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. They're great plants, but they're pot plants. So if you take that home and you plant it in the garden, I can guarantee you it's not going to look like that next year if it's even still alive. So I'm going to explain why in just a minute. But first, we got to talk about pruning. So a third mistake that people commonly make is pruning at the wrong time. What do most people do? Most people prune hydrangeas in the winter, but this is not always correct. So this is a picture of Hydrangea macrophylla in the winter. I mean, that looks like a great time to prune, right? If you got bare stems, it looks kind of ratty. Yeah, absolutely, we should go cut these back. No, 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 it's the wrong time. So the correct time to prune depends on the species and when the plants set flower buds. So not all hydrangeas produce flower buds at the same time and place. That dictates when we prune. Okay, so when do we prune? Well, with smooth hydrangea and panicle hydrangea, you want to prune these in winter or spring. And the reason for this is because they produce flower buds on new growth. So what does that mean? That means that if you go out there in winter, now it's important that we're truly in winter. The plants need to go dormant, drop their leaves. Anytime between that and before they begin to leaf out in spring, if you prune these plants back, now this can be selective pruning of stems, it can be rejuvenating by cutting it all the way back, however you choose to prune. If you prune at that time, you're removing old growth or previous season's growth. You're leaving behind some buds, either lateral buds along the stem or basal buds down at the crown. And those will grow, produce new growth in that spring. And these species flower on that new growth. They will produce new flower buds on that new growth. So that's when you prune smooth hydrangea and panicle hydrangea. In fact, many people cut smooth hydrangea to the ground, like literally mow it down, just cut it to the ground, and it will regrow and flower reliably every year doing that because it's flowering on new growth. One other point with smooth hydrangea is that you can deadhead it or remove the old flowers right after flowering. And oftentimes, nearly every year, it's going to produce a second flush of flowers because it pushes out new growth and it flowers again. So just keep in mind, smooth hydrangea, panicle hydrangea, we would prune in winter or spring. Okay, oak leaf hydrangea and big leaf hydrangea, we want to prune in summer. This is where people go wrong, is that people prune big leaf hydrangea in the winter, and you don't want to do that. So these should be pruned in summer immediately after flowering. So if we look at this picture, this is a picture of an oak leaf hydrangea. The flowers have faded. They've actually started to turn brown. The plant is setting seed now. This would be the time to go in and prune right now. Ideally, you do it before you see any new growth beginning to emerge, because if you look closely at a plant at this stage, you would begin to see buds breaking here with new growth coming out. So you would want to go ahead and prune at this stage, and then that allows the plant time to produce new growth later in the summer and set buds for the next season, because these two species flower on old growth. What that means is that right now, as hydrangeas are flowering, after they flower, they're going to push out some new growth, and they're going to go ahead and set flower buds that carry all the way through the winter, and those preformed buds will be the ones that flower next year. So it's very, very important that you're pruning before that growth takes place. If we prune in winter or we prune in spring, we're removing all of that old growth. We're removing those preformed flower buds. Now, we do want to avoid pruning in fall. If we prune in fall, then this can encourage new growth too late in the year, and it's damaged by cold weather. So don't do that. And I want to make a note that some cultivars of big leaf hydrangea flower on new growth. These are what we call rebloomers. We'll talk a little bit more about this. But even those can still be pruned in summer. So if you just stick in your head, big leaf hydrangea and oak leaf hydrangea, we prune in summer. Okay, I kept telling you we were going to talk more about flower bud production and flowering. So here it is. Don't you love the title of the slide? More on flower bud production. Says it all, right? So flower bud production varies by species, but even by cultivar. So I already told you that smooth hydrangea and panicle hydrangea flower on new growth, and big leaf hydrangea and oak leaf hydrangea flower on old growth. So there's differences in species, but on the very next slide, we'll actually look at differences between cultivars within the same species. And we'll talk a little bit about that here. So when we talk specifically about big leaf hydrangea, and the reason I'm talking specifically about that plant is I think arguably that is the most popular species. That is the one I think people have the most trouble with, because plants that flower on new growth, like smooth hydrangea and panicle hydrangea, you almost can't mess that up. Now you can still prune them wrong so they don't look very nice, and you can still plant it in the wrong site, but they flower on new growth. So as long as the plant's alive and producing growth, you get flowers. But with big leaf hydrangea, this is where so many people go wrong. So some cultivars, this is Hydrangea macrophylla, big leaf hydrangea, only produce flower buds at the terminals. So think of this as the florist type hydrangeas. Again, you go in the grocery store, you see that nice pot plant, and it's maybe a foot tall, and there's a flower on the top of each stem. That was bred, that was selected that it would grow a certain number of nodes, certain number of sets of leaves, and then it would terminate with a flower, because that's what it needs to look like. It needs to be a certain size in that pot, and that's what it was developed for, and it serves a great purpose. But those plants were selected to not have flower buds along the lateral buds or along the length to the stem, only at the terminals. So plants like this, cultivars of big leaf hydrangea that only have terminal flower buds, our flowering is going to be highly affected by cold weather and or pruning at the wrong time, because anything that happens to damage that terminal bud all the way from this summer into, or let's say this fall after it's finished growing, until next spring, summer, as it would start to flower, anything, a deer bites it off, you prune it, a limb falls and breaks it off, the cold damages it, you lose flowers. So those plants that only produce flower buds terminally are the least reliable for flowering. Other cultivars produce flower buds at the terminals, but then also along the length of the stem at some or all of the lateral buds. So then these would be more reliable when it comes to flowering, because even if something happens to that terminal bud, again, deer bites it out, you just can't help yourself and you go prune anyway, or the cold damages that, you're still going to have some lateral buds that survive. And those, if they have set flower buds in these cultivars, then you can still get flowering that next year. The last category, though, which is the newest type of big leaf hydrangeas, are these remontant or reblooming types. And so these are cultivars that produce flower buds on both old and new growth. So think of these like the smooth hydrangea or the panicle hydrangea, in that as long as they produce new growth, you get flower bud production. So with these cultivars, flowering is most reliable, since the plant could actually be killed or pruned to the ground, and as long as it regrows, it would still flower. So let's look at what this means. And I probably should have put this slide on the previous, or the picture on the previous slide, but I didn't want to mess up my pretty picture, so I stuck it here. So in case anybody wasn't following what I was saying about the terminal buds versus the lateral buds, so we could actually call these apical or terminal buds, or we can call them axillary or lateral buds. So hydrangeas have opposite leaf arrangement. This is not a hydrangea. I know it's a horrible diagram, and I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But it shows the point that I'm making. So with florist hydrangeas, we would have flower buds only produced right here at the terminal. With some cultivars, we get flower buds at the terminal, and then some of these lateral buds would also contain flower buds. With the reblooming types, they're going to produce flower buds on new growth. So, okay, so now let's look at this table. Now I give you some data. Not a lot. We're not going to go into too much depth. And I just realized I forgot to do something. I meant to draw some circles around the important stuff here. So just follow me. This is a table of about I think it's roughly 18 cultivars of Hydrangea macrophylla. And there's the information at the top if you want to look at this. What's very interesting, if we look at this very first column, this is the researcher went through and dissected buds and then looked at them to determine whether or not there were flower buds present. And so what he found was that almost all of the cultivars that he investigated, now granted, this is just a handful, but almost all of them, all except one, 100% of the terminal buds had flower buds present. That's pretty interesting. But this one cultivar, Aisha, I don't know if anybody's ever grown Aisha before or seen it in a garden. We had it in the trial garden at the University of Georgia, and it almost never flowered. You would see like one flower. Well, what's the reason for that? Only a third, only 33% of the terminal buds even contained a flower bud. Now this one also had some hardiness issues, so it tended to die back a little bit. But as you can see here, out of these cultivars, Aisha is going to be less reliable when it comes to flowering because not even all the terminal buds have a flower bud present. What's really interesting is if we look over here to this third column under lateral buds, and here's the percentage of lateral buds that had flower buds present. So let's again look at Aisha, the second row, and if we follow, we say only 1/3, 33% of the terminals had flower buds present. Only 10% of the lateral buds had flower buds present. What this means is that certain cultivars, the more they are killed back, the more they're pruned at the wrong time, the less likely they are to flower. So this would be an example of why something like Aisha doesn't flower very well. Likewise, if we look down towards Niagara, down here near the bottom, it's one with like dark kind of black purple stems. 100% of the terminals have flower buds. 0% of the laterals had flower buds. So if anything happens to those terminals, no flower production that year. Now, I want to point out two other things, and then I just have a couple more slides and we'll take questions. This very top line, all summer beauty. So some people would say all summer beauty is a rebloomer. It flowers every year in my garden, or I cut it back and it rebloomed, it produced new flowers. What's key here is that all summer beauty not only has all the terminals of flower buds, 92%, nearly all the laterals also contain flower buds. What that means is, again, damage the terminal and the laterals grow and we get flowering. Or even after it's flowered from the lateral buds, the terminal bud, the lateral buds can break and some flowers may be produced. Now, these are not being produced on new growth because they were present from the previous season. All right, if you're still with me, the last point I want to make is down here towards the bottom, pennymac. Maybe you've heard of this one, maybe you haven't. Pennymac was named for Penny McHenry, who lived in Atlanta. She was former president of the American Hydrangea Society. And pennymac was selected, looks almost identical to the original Endless Summer. And again, you see very high percentage of lateral buds with flowers. But in addition, this one will produce flowers on new growth. Okay, so hopefully you can see from this table where we're getting these differences in flower production, specifically with big leaf hydrangeas. So when people ask questions, we can make some blanket statements, which I'm about to make, of why flowering is sometimes negatively impacted, but I want you to understand how it can vary even by cultivar. Okay, so just a few more slides. The last mistake people make is not watering and fertilizing properly. Remember at the beginning, I said hydrangeas have relatively large leaves, and so they also have a relatively high water requirement. They lose a lot of water. In fact, hydrangeas can oftentimes, especially big leaf hydrangea, can wilt even when it's not dry. It's just so hot that it's losing water faster than it can take up. So there could be moisture present in the soil, but it's still wilting. But it's important to note, we all know supplemental water is beneficial for new plants, meaning simply you plant a plant, you need to water it, you can't just rely on the rain. We know that. But sometimes we take for granted that established plants, those plants established, it doesn't need supplemental water. Hydrangeas benefit during hot and droughty periods. Understand that flower production is stressful on the plants, takes a lot of energy to produce flowers, so supplemental watering and fertilization are going to help to develop healthy plants and maximize flowering. I'm making a general statement about fertilizer because fertilizers, there's gobs of them and there isn't any one magic fertilizer that works. The point is a general purpose nursery landscape fertilizer, fertilizer for shrubs and trees, flowering shrubs, anything like that will work. Just follow the label for timing and rate. Don't use houseplant fertilizer. If you have some leftover African violet fertilizer, don't use that, but any general purpose stuff is gonna work pretty well. Okay, so 2 more slides and I'm done. Yes, okay, so factors that limit flowering. Drought. Drought has a negative impact on plants. It stresses plants and can limit flowering. Disease. We talked a little bit about disease. Again, disease stresses plants, can limit flowering. Improper pruning. We talked a lot about pruning, when to prune, when not to prune. The wrong sun exposure or improper sighting of a plant can also limit flowering. We stick for example, a shade-loving plant in full sun, it's stressed, it's not going to flower very well. The other way around too, we take a panicle hydrangea that likes full sun and we stick it in full shade, it's not going to flower well. Too much nitrogen fertilizer, so a fertilizer, for example, for lawns, where we're pushing a lot of nitrogen for green grass, is going to push a lot of leaves and not as many flowers. And then early fall frost, late spring frost. So early fall, plants are rocking along. We've had a warm fall. They're not acclimating to colder temperatures. They're still actively growing. And then all of a sudden, bam, we have a frost. That really damages plants. That damages flower buds. Sometimes flower buds can be more sensitive than the stems themselves. So you may not see stem die back, but it may kill flower buds. Same thing with late spring frost and fluctuating winter temperatures. Fluctuating winter temperatures, very important in areas that go up and down through the winter, because we think of a plant, oh, this plant's cold hardy, it survives, it can survive even colder regions than here, but the plants are acclimating and deacclimating through the winter if temperatures are going up and down, and then cold temperatures damage flowers. Okay, so we want you to have this, not this. And last slide. So choosing the correct type of hydrangea based on the site, choosing a cultivar based on its characteristics, prune it at the correct time, give it some supplemental water during hot, dry weather, and a little bit of fertilizer, and then you can enjoy beautiful flowers as a reward for your efforts and be the envy of all your neighbors and gardening friends, even your non-gardening friends. Okay, thank you. I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. That was a really great presentation, and there's some things that I will definitely use to help my hydrangeas along. We have had a few questions come in, and if anybody has any more, we do still have a few minutes, so please feel free to type those into the chat box. The first is, are there hydrangeas that would do best with some tree root competition?
All right, so I think what I'm hearing in that question is, in a situation where you have tree root competition, are there ones that do better than others? Okay, yes. That's a tough one. If you're having tree root competition, I'm going to assume we're talking about a shaded site. Now, I realize that depending on orientation, you could have tree root competition and still actually have full sun in that area. If it's full sun, I would definitely go with panicle hydrangea, because it is the most drought tolerant. It's the most urban tolerant, most tolerant of like compacted soil, of competition. And it will do okay also in partial shade. It's just not going to tolerate heavy shade. Aside from that, there's not really like a best option necessarily. I think the best bet is going to be supplemental watering, understanding though tree roots are still going to go in there and colonize that new soil and help themselves to it. So some trees are better than others. Some trees are more deeply rooted than others. You think, for example, about maples. Red maples specifically tend to be surface rooted. You really would want to avoid planting a hydrangea near like a red maple, because those roots are just right there. But trees that have a deeper root system are not going to have as much of an issue. For example, I've seen a lot of hydrangeas planted in pine shade that do very, very well.
Great, thanks. So this individual has a big leaf hydrangea that was originally blue, and then it was planted next to a brick house. And is there any way to return it permanently to a blue shade, or are they stuck with pink for the foreseeable future?
No. So flower color in big leaf hydrangea, this is a question that always comes up, can change. Understand that there are some cultivars that change more readily than others, but most of the ones that are pink or blue can go either way. There are a few exceptions to that. So that is affected ultimately by aluminum, but it's kind of complicated because it's really pH. And so in acidic soils, I want to make sure I absolutely tell you this right. I'm scared I'm going to say it wrong to somebody. So I have a note here, because this is where people always ask this question. So in acidic soils, aluminum is available, and aluminum binds with the pigments in the flowers and turns them blue. In more basic soils, the aluminum becomes unavailable, and the plants tend to be pink. So what's happening is that if you want to turn a pink hydrangea blue, then you're going to add aluminum sulfate, because you want to make sure you have aluminum, and you want to try to create a little bit of an acidic soil. Anything you can do to create a more acidic soil. But what's happening is that if you want to turn a blue hydrangea pink, then you would add dolomitic limestone, which is going to help to turn the soil more basic, and that aluminum becomes unavailable and the plant turns pink. So in your case, you're having some lime that's leaching out of probably the mortar from the brick, and that plant is turning pink. So you can apply aluminum sulfate, and you can work to acidify that soil a little bit to get it back blue. But you're probably going to have to do that every year. It's not going to be like a once and done.
Great, thanks. When pruning a large oak leaf, how far do you cut back the branch?
You can cut as far as you want. So when it comes to pruning, there's like many different ways to prune. I mean, we do an entire webinar on pruning for different methods for different reasons. So there's obviously pruning just for shaping. There's pruning to remove damaged or diseased stems or branches. There's rejuvenation pruning. But any of these plants, you can cut all the way back to the ground. Even a full-grown oak leaf hydrangea, you could cut it all the way back to the ground and it would regrow. So it really kind of depends on what your goal is. Like if it's overgrowing some steps or something and you need to prune it back, I would recommend probably pruning further back than you want to grow, because you don't want your hydrangea to look like a pruned hedge. You know, that's not ideal. They have large leaves and you're not going in and clipping it with well, I mean, maybe you are, but I wouldn't recommend that. And so you don't want to just sort of shape it around something. You'd prefer to cut a branch further back so that it can kind of regrow and look more natural.
Great. The next one we have is on transplanting. So how well do established hydrangeas transplant? And is there a best time to transplant?
Yeah. I would say, like most plants, there's a lot of factors involved. Hydrangeas can be transplanted fairly easily for several reasons. One, they tend to not have a really deep root system. They don't have like super thick roots, so it's fairly easy to get a lot of the root system. The more of the root system you get, the better. So the bigger root ball you can dig, the better. Best time to do it would be, I would say, in winter or spring. And then that way, the plant's dormant. Two, if you do it in like early spring, then you replant it, and as soon as you get it replanted, it's going to start producing new roots and start anchoring into its new spot. There are some tips, like the bigger the plant, you may want to consider actually root pruning a year before or earlier in the year, coming in with like a spade and root pruning around sort of the drip line of the shrub to go ahead and sever some of those roots that are further out, and to encourage root branching closer to the plant. So do that before you dig, so it has some time to develop a new roots closer to the plant. But I would definitely recommend cutting the plant back pretty significantly depending on the overall size. I mean, you could cut it back to a third of its original size and that would not be any problem. Now, understanding that you're probably going to affect flowering for that year.
Okay, is there a best time to fertilize hydrangeas?
I would say with most flowering shrubs, I would recommend fertilizing in spring. Thinking about that most plants are going to have that big flush of new growth in spring. So you're giving fertilizer to the plant. The plant's taking up nutrients from the soil. It's getting its food, its minerals from the soil, but it's limited in what's right there. So you can kind of think of fertilizer as maybe like vitamins or just a boost. And so you want to give it that before it has to go through that big flush of growth. Now, if you're feeding something that's a little more specifically geared to producing flowers, you may choose to give that a little bit later as flower buds are starting to develop. I would not fertilize in fall though, because you don't want to encourage new growth going into going into winter, because anything you're doing, if you're pruning in fall, if you're fertilizing in fall, you run the risk of encouraging new growth that then gets damaged by cold temperatures in winter.
All right, and that takes us right to 11. So I think there are a few questions that we didn't get to, but hopefully we made it through most of them. But thank you so much, Josh, for joining us this morning. I really appreciated this, and I hope that all of our master gardeners who joined us have been able to take something back, maybe for their own yard, and also for some of the clients that they might help with their own hydrangeas. So thanks again, and thanks everyone for joining us. We will see you next month, again, the third Thursday, and on tree risk assessment.
Okay, thank you all.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.